Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. I'm talking today to Maureen Carroll, Professor of Archaeology at the University of York. Maureen spent about a decade researching her book Infancy and Earliest Childhood in the Roman World. It was published in 2018. Although the study of children and childhood in the ancient world is not uncommon, it seems that infancy has been seriously overlooked. So welcome, Maureen, and tell me, when did you first realise that there was such a lacuna in our knowledge?
Well, I published a book in 2006 on Roman funerary inscriptions, and that was a very interesting piece of research because I chose to look at how Romans recorded their own lives, even if it was just a snapshot, name, age at death, where they came from. And I noticed that there was an underrepresentation of funerary inscriptions that commemorate very young children. They do exist, but they seem to be in the minority. So looking into that, I discovered all kinds of opinions of modern scholars that children in the Roman world had no social persona. They had very little value to the family or to society, and therefore we can't expect them to have been mourned properly and commemorated the way older children and adults might be. That struck me as a bit strange. It seemed a little bit black and white and a little bit too extreme to me. And so once I finished that book, I wanted to do a project looking at infant death and burial. And this was something quite novel because I'd read that Romans rarely buried their infants properly, and that they were not mourned when they died at the age of a few months or a year. And I thought, well, that's all very interesting to say, but has anybody actually gone to the cemeteries? Has anybody looked at the excavation reports of cemeteries? Has anybody done the donkey work of going through volume after volume after volume of excavation reports and looking for the evidence for infant burials in communal cemeteries, in settlements, anywhere else? The answer was no, no one had. So that was my project, to look at the archaeological evidence, because there's very often a discrepancy between written sources and the archaeological evidence. I think they're designed to tell us different things. And to my surprise, I found that infants were sometimes underrepresented in cemeteries in Roman Italy, but quite often they are overrepresented. I found that babies, very young children, a month, 6 months old, were buried in properly made containers, especially for them, with all kinds of grave goods. And that suggested to me that Roman parents certainly did care when their children died, and they had invested a lot of care into burying them properly. And so you can see where this is going. I thought, okay, this is Italy, but I tend to work empire-wide because I think it's interesting to look at a broader picture chronologically and geographically, because the Roman Empire is a very vast and diverse people with different cultures, different languages, different histories. And not everyone would have the same attitude towards anything in the Roman world. So I wanted to do some kind of diachronic and cross-cultural study of infancy. What did an infant mean to a family? What did young children mean to Roman society? What kind of evidence is out there that we can tap into, not just archaeological and not just textual? And so that was the background of that. And luckily, there is a burgeoning field of research on the Roman family and Roman childhood. By and large, we have an Australian ancient historian to thank for this, and that is Professor Beryl Rawson of ANU, who started a series, a very successful series of conferences called the Roman Family Conference. She started the first one in 1981 in Canberra. And since then, the Roman Family Conference has taken place every few years, I think 3 times in Canberra, but it's also taken place in Canada and in Britain and various other places. So there is a body of research out there on the Roman family, and it's recognized as an important topic to study if we're trying to understand Roman society. And yet, in all that research, very little attention had ever been paid to the very youngest members of society. And so I felt it was worth looking at those children under the age of 1 who are either not mentioned very often in Roman sources, the written sources, or who are neglected in modern scholarly work as well.
So the archaeological evidence is there, but what work has been done previously?
Oh, there were a couple case studies, yes. In particular, I would say that there is one other scholarly group that has paid attention in the last few years to infancy and infant death and burial, and that's in France and Switzerland. There's been a lot more attention paid to this topic there, more so than anywhere else, actually. And I found that quite inspirational because much of that is based on true archaeological evidence of excavating graves and grave goods, looking at the paraphernalia of childhood, the depictions of children on Gallo-Roman tombstones, things like that. So it was clear to me that that kind of study could be done, but it needed to be done more widely. But as so often in the study of the ancient world, we have different groups of specialists who look at different types of evidence, and those specialists often don't talk to each other. And so looking at this topic in particular, I thought it needed to tap into various disciplines. For one thing, I needed to read up on bioarchaeology. What can the excavation and the analysis of human bone tell us about things like age at weaning, particular problems during pregnancy, etc. So that was something that needed to be looked at. Ancient history was of relative unimportance, I think, in this study because historical records deal with big and important people and historical events, and children aren't going to find any mention in those. But there are other texts like papyrus texts from documents from Egypt, and they record really the minutiae of life and household composition, things like that. Birth notices, medical treatises on gynecology, what a woman goes through when pregnant, antenatal care, what is to be done when a baby is born, postnatal care for a baby, that kind of thing. Archaeology is obviously important because it meant looking at the material culture, looking at graves and their contents, also looking at depictions on monuments. Epigraphy is also something important, which is a discipline on its own, doesn't often talk to archaeology, but here we have the funerary inscriptions, and they're really important for recording lives cut too short. And there are philosophical texts, personal letters and poems. I didn't think had been tapped into adequately. And of course, there are the legal texts, and that's a whole different branch of ancient history. But when we look at the legal texts, we see that the status of infants are discussed. And even an infant in utero, an unborn child, had legal rights. So by looking at all these types of evidence, which is something that no one had done before, putting the fragments together, I thought we might have a much better chance of understanding what it meant to be a 6-month-old or a 1-year-old in Roman society.
Right. So a multidisciplinary approach is absolutely essential. A material culture approach is necessary. But how did you go about it and get past the dominance of the literary texts?
Well, obviously, I collected all of the written sources that I could get hold of, but I didn't want to let that influence me. I have a background in classical studies. I did a classics degree, so reading historical documents and synthesizing them and using them with caution is not a problem. But I didn't want to give the texts primacy here because I think they have misled us. I mentioned earlier that children don't appear in historical texts about events and battles and conquest and things like that because they don't play a role. Are we to take that then that children are completely unimportant to any of the Roman authors? Of course, no one would do that. But people had looked at a particular set of texts, I thought, and these are largely personal letters or philosophical treatises written as letters of consolation to people who have lost a child. And these are letters of consolation. They would not be understood as consolation in our sense today in the modern world, because basically it's about, well, buck up. You've lost a baby, so what? It's a fragment of time. Let's not let this get us down. And that was taken as indicative of what all Romans everywhere thought all the time. But we have to keep in mind that these texts were written by an elite group of male Romans in Rome who were adherents of Stoic philosophy. And the Stoics are a special case because they believed that life was to be lived and death was to be performed in moderation and with decorum. And therefore, one should not succumb to overtly performative public mourning and displays of grief. That's what that's about. It's about public mourning. It's not about grief, which cannot be regulated by law or any other way. And I thought the best way to find out whether people did feel something, a sense of loss when their children died, was to look at the graves to see what care they invested in burying them. That is an expression of private grief. It's got nothing to do with public mourning. And that was really a good way of approaching it, because I realized that families everywhere, no matter where actually, across the Roman Empire, did pay attention to giving their children a proper burial. And sometimes with grave assemblages or comments on the funerary marker that are, they almost make you want to cry. They're so poignant. And that's the kind of thing we would miss out entirely if we only relied on the texts. So instead of front-loading the texts, which most people have done, this is what Romans say about childhood, and let's throw in some pictures as a bit of eye candy, the odd tombstone with a child on it, or a baby rattle, just to sort of round it out. I decided to do it the other way, to not comment on the texts at all, apart from the medical texts and the legal texts, which really do tell us something much more important, and to look at the material culture and to let that guide me. And then in the very last chapter, to compare what the material culture and the archaeology tells us with what those consolatory texts tell us. And the picture could not be more starkly different. And you realize that these are written with a very particular purpose for a very specific group of people, and they have a point, and that is to console someone to not give in to grief. It does not tell us that Romans did not love their infants and that they did not care when they died.
Following on from that, can you give me a grasp of the archaeological case studies that you used to illustrate a more rounded understanding of the treatment of Roman infants?
Okay, well, I could think of one that I did in some detail because I found it quite interesting, and that's looking at Marseille. Now, when I was doing research on the book, because I wanted to look at it empire-wide and to understand cultural differences, I thought it would be a good idea to understand what made those different cultures tick in the pre-Roman period, and perhaps differences that we see in the Roman period in attitudes towards children or the way they're represented or treated might have something to do with the pre-Roman background that's rooted in the past rather than in the Roman period. And so I was able to see that in the Iron Age, from about the 8th century BC, we can isolate two very different cultural groups in the way that they deal with the death of infants and the disposal of infants. We have the group in the West, in Gaul, in Britain, and in northern Spain, where children, when they die at a premature age, are buried under the floors of houses within settlements. They're not buried in a communal cemetery with adults and older children. And then we have the second group, which is more central and eastern Mediterranean. We find it partly in southern Italy, where we have Greek colonies, and in Greece itself, where children from a very early age are buried with parents, family, etc., in communal cemeteries. So I thought that was interesting. And it made me think about Marseille on the south coast of France, because Marseille, of course, is within that Celtic Gallic realm. And of course, Marseille is a settlement that goes back into the early Iron Age, where we have evidence for burial of children under floors of houses and so on. But in the 6th century, Greeks settle in Marseille and they set up a Greek colony. And of course, if you live in a Greek colony, you die in a Greek colony, and there are cemeteries all the way around Marseille. Then it becomes a Roman city and there are Roman burials. So it seemed to me that you'd have something Iron Age, Greek and Roman. And let's look at that and see if we can follow these cultural differences. And it was quite evident that there are specific ways that the Greek colonists buried their children, and they are always in the communal cemetery. No longer are children that die prematurely buried under the floors in settlements, so it's following that Greek cultural pattern. They're buried in things like specially made wooden coffins, they're given grave goods, and so on. And then when we come to the Roman period, we find that there are even more very young children represented in the graves. They are buried in different containers. There are still some coffins being used, but largely it's stone containers or ceramic containers, that kind of thing. And there's a slightly different set of grave goods that are given to them. So I thought that was a fairly useful thing to do. And it also allowed me to explore the idea of children who had not been born full term, but might have been fetuses or premature or stillbirths. If we're thinking that if we believe with modern scholars that a very young child had no social persona, no value to society, would we then expect that the premature infants and fetuses, etc., would we expect them to be buried in the cemetery and to be given the same amount of care as those that were born full term? And the answer is quite often in Gaul and in Marseille, yes, we do find them. There they are. And again, it sheds light on this idea of what makes up a person. And even today, there are various differences culturally and legally about what personhood is and who is a person morally and legally. And I think in antiquity that existed as well. So that was a very good case study to follow broadly, chronologically, with 3 different cultures, how infant mortality was handled, both within the family and within society.
So personhood is quite evident in the archaeological evidence. Is this apparent across the Roman world?
Well, I looked at the length and breadth of Italy. I had the great fortune to have a fellowship to study at the British School in Rome for 3 months and just plowed through the library on sometimes very obscure Italian journals, but there it was, all waiting for me to be mined, so to speak. I looked at Gaul, all of it. I looked at Spain. I looked at Roman Germany and the Netherlands as well. I looked at Roman Britain, Greece, North Africa, some parts of the west coast of Anatolia, a little bit of the Middle East, Jordan and Israel, if there was evidence, and also evidence from the northern Roman provinces along the Danube. So I tried to be as inclusive as I could be.
And relationships with young children are strongly represented. So is this where the material culture departs from the documentary evidence?
Well, it's taken me to the point to realize that, well, I feel like I've rehabilitated the babies somehow, because I think the evidence I looked at suggests that not everywhere and not always, but children were genuinely wanted and loved, and they were an important part of society. And I thought it was really important to look at those under the age of 1. I know that sounds very specific, but it's very specific for a reason, because the Roman legal texts tell us that if a child died before its first birthday, it was not to be mourned at all. So that first birthday was a bit of a milestone, and it's one that modern scholars cite over and over again. So you see, a child in the first year of life counted for nothing. Infant mortality was so high that Roman parents protected themselves against emotional engagement with their children in case they would lose them. But finding out that a fetus within its mother's womb already had legal rights and could already be the recipient of an inheritance was quite an eye-opener. To realize by looking at the medical treatises that a child in the uterus, while the mother is pregnant, had a kind of life course where there are stages of growing within the womb that doctors were aware of and discuss in their medical treatises. That was really interesting. It was also interesting to see that the first year of life after birth was packed full of milestones, you know, within the first bath and so on, and then the child is given the breast, so it's starting to be fed. Then on the 8th day for girls, the 9th day for boys, it's named officially. That's a milestone. Within 30 days, the birth of the child had to be officially registered in front of magistrates. So the child at that point has to be registered in written form. It has to be witnessed as well. And what is recorded are the parent's name, the sex and name of the child, the date and place of birth, and the domicile of the parents. So already within 30 days, a child has a context that is familial, social, and civic. That's really interesting. Then the beginning of weaning at about the age of 6 months. That's another major milestone. And after about 3 months or so, the swaddling bands are unwrapped from the child so it can start to move and perhaps behave in a more lively fashion. And then the first birthday, a major milestone that 30% of children probably never would have lived to see. That is something that is celebrated. So for me, I think looking at this age group in detail like this suggests that we've been far too general in looking at childhood as something monolithic without realizing that each stage in a child's life was something very specific. And it related to the family and to society in different ways. But to say that a child under the age of 1 did not have a personhood. I just think that can be refuted at every turn. And so I think that it just reinforces my opinion that childhood, children, the family, these are real essential building blocks of Roman society. And unless we understand these various life stages of individuals, we're never really going to comprehend what that meant.
Is the identity of the infant very significant? Can we see their characters coming through?
Yes, for example, if we look at tombstones, inscriptions and depictions of children at the age of 6 months, 8 months, and anything in between up to the age of a year, we can see that the child is embedded within a social context. It has a name, just as I said, from the birth declaration. Its parents are named. Its civic identity will sometimes be named. It will say that it's a citizen of such and such a city. So it's already a citizen. So it really has a social and civic identity. It is a person and a member of that particular group. Also, I found that infants were invested with a gendered identity very early on in their lives. So you will find infants being buried with toys that suggest some sort of a masculine identity, or miniature gladiuses, miniature Roman legionary swords, that kind of thing, although a little boy's not going to be playing with that. But it suggests to me that a masculine identity is already being created for this child. Or they might be buried with something like a vase that would be given to a girl on the day of her wedding. And obviously, this is before a girl would ever be married, if she died at the age of 8 months, for example. But again, it's some sort of a gendered identity being invested in the child. And it suggests to me that the parents were already looking forward to the future, and they compensate for that future not existing by putting things that might have been a little bit too old or a little bit too developed in the grave with that child to make up for that loss. So things like cuts of meat and pork and so on, with a child who's 8 months old, that child would not have teeth yet. It wouldn't have consumed that meal, but it would have in future had it lived. Or a pair of hobnailed boots that are too big for a 4-month-old boy. It didn't wear those boots, but it would have had it lived. So that kind of compensatory device is everywhere in the archaeological record as well. And given the legal status of a child, not just when it's born, but also when it's in its mother's womb, it already has a legal status. I know that's legal, and there is a difference between a legal status and a moral status and a cultural status, but I do think that we should really not dismiss this very young age group, because all the evidence I have points in that direction, that they were real people who were looked to for the advancement, the well-being of the family, and as contributors to society in general.
I know in the medieval period there was often an ideal age to be depicted at in death. So how do the characters manifest? Are they placed upon the child by the parents?
There's quite a few of them where the age at death is given, and the child is already standing and perhaps wearing a little toga and already reciting, so that's not possible. And I think, again, that we have the difficulty of knowing whether some of these monuments might have been bought. They were prefabricated, they're bought from a shop, if you like, but perhaps made for an older child and then used by someone who had a younger child. That's a possibility. You might say that Roman sculptors were not skilled enough to represent infants. That, I can tell you, is wrong. But it also might be that, again, the family is kind of compensating, adding a few years onto the life of that baby to compensate for it not having got to the age of a 4, 5, 6, or 7-year-old. The age of 7, of course, is when infants left infancy. Children were deemed no longer to be infants. The age of 7 is when they started to be educated, where they were thought to be able to speak and think and write. And so the age of 7 is quite important as a milestone, socially, I suppose. But of course, children under 1 who died in that age group never accomplished that. So there is that group of depictions that show the child looking older than it really was, according to the inscription. But there are also numerous stones I found, particularly the ones that commemorate a mother who may have died in childbirth with her infant, where the infant is depicted as a baby, a tiny baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, cradled by its mother. Or There are others where you can see we're looking at a toddler who might be 6, 7, 8 months old, crawling around, playing with a rattle, looking precisely the way a child at that age would have looked. So I think there's a variety of factors involved here, but yes, it is the case that sometimes children just look older than they really were. And, it's a phenomenon that appears in Greek art as well. And it, as you say, it appears in medieval and more recent art as well.
Well, this has made a major contribution to an area that we had very little on before. Where do you go from here?
There are a variety of things I could see myself involved in. I'm still very much inspired by the monuments that people set up to commemorate themselves and their families. And I could only skim the surface in this study of how children are represented. I'm very interested in the idea of how families are depicted, mothers and fathers with their children. And one thing I've noticed is that when we see funerary monuments, primarily in Rome, but also in Italy, you might see, if a child is represented at all, mother, father, child, classic nuclear family. And yet when you go to some other places on the frontiers, like on the Danube, for example, or even in Gaul, you find that the family is depicted in quite a different way. People seem to really revel in the fact that they might have several children. So you find the family depicted with mother, father, 5, 6 children, all lined up, advertising the success of the family and how important children were within that particular region. And I think that's something that I would like to explore a little bit more. The sort of the visual and the artistic devices used to represent the family, keeping in mind that the family is not the same everywhere in the Roman Empire. The family in Rome might be something very different in Pannonia on the Danube. I think there's a lot more that could be done with that. So that's something I would like to return to at some point.
Of course, this is a fairly new field, but what do you want to see follow on from your work in the future?
What I hope my research has contributed to the field is, I hope I've been a champion for a multidisciplinary approach to this subject, or any subject actually. We are very fortunate in Roman archaeology that we have a vast array of material culture. We also have a vast array of written sources. We're extremely fortunate in that. And yet those types of evidence are often compartmentalized, I believe. And even though we have a lot of evidence, we're still basically only scratching the surface. So if we want to do anything more than scratch the surface, I think we have to look at every scrap of evidence, as I've tried to do here, from different disciplines. Be brave. Look at epigraphy. Look at medical texts. Look at legal texts. Do a bit of a foray into somebody else's expertise. You can't really make a huge mistake. And I think the reward is there, that you have a much more nuanced picture of reality.
Maureen, thank you so much for talking to me today, and I hope we'll catch up again soon. The details of Maureen's book are up on the website, and I hope you'll join me next time on Foreign Countries.